The galaxy hung in uneasy silence, its stars flickering like dying embers against the vast cosmic void. Humanity had tasted victory against the Dominion, their first real triumph in a war that had raged across countless worlds, but peace felt as fragile as morning frost. In the deepest reaches of space, where no patrol ships dared venture and no colonies had taken root, Research Station Omega-7 drifted like a forgotten monument to human ambition. The massive structure stretched nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern, its sleek metal hull scarred by micrometeorite impacts and solar radiation. Inside its labyrinthine corridors, dim emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with each flicker. The station's crew of 200 had been handpicked from humanity's finest, scientists, engineers, military advisors, all sworn to secrecy about their work developing next-generation defensive systems. Dar. Elena Vasquez pressed her palm against the observation deck's reinforced viewport, watching the endless darkness beyond. The research director's reflection stared back at her, tired eyes, graying temples, the weight of command etched into every line of her weathered face. Behind her, the soft hum of life support systems provided the only sound in the cavernous space. "Something's wrong," she whispered to herself, though she couldn't quite name what unsettled her. The station felt different lately, as if the very air had grown thick and oppressive. Reports of equipment malfunctions had increased over the past week, minor glitches that maintenance dismissed as routine wear. But Elena's instincts, honed by decades of scientific inquiry, screamed that nothing about their situation was routine. In the depths of the station, something stirred that should not have existed. It moved through ventilation shafts and crawled along power conduits, invisible to sensors and silent as death itself. The entity had no name in any human language, for it predated humanity's first steps into space by eons. It was patient, calculating, and utterly alien in its hunger. The first symptoms appeared like whispers in the dark. Chief Engineer Marcus Chen stumbled into the medical bay, his usually steady hands trembling as he described waves of nausea and disorientation. Dr. Sarah Kim, the station's chief medical officer, ran every diagnostic she could think of, blood work, brain scans, genetic markers, but found nothing abnormal. "Maybe it's just stress," she suggested, administering a mild sedative. "We've all been pushing hard on the new defense grid project." But Chen wasn't the only one. Over the next 48 hours, 17 more crew members reported similar symptoms: weakness, fatigue, moments of confusion where they couldn't remember where they were or what they'd been doing. The medical bay began to feel less like a healing center and more like a morgue waiting to happen. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the station's security chief, noticed the changes before anyone else. Crew members he'd known for years seemed different, their responses delayed, their eyes vacant, as if they were listening to voices only they could hear. During routine security briefings, some officers would stare blankly at walls for minutes at a time before snapping back to attention with no memory of the lapse. "We need to consider quarantine protocols," Morrison told Elena during an emergency staff meeting. The conference room felt smaller than usual, shadows seeming to press in from all sides despite the overhead lighting. "Whatever's happening, it's spreading." Elena nodded grimly, her fingers drumming against the polished table. Around them sat the station's senior staff, those who still seemed unaffected by the mysterious condition. Dr. Kim looked exhausted, having worked around the clock trying to identify the cause. Chief Science Officer Dr. Robert Hayes sat rigid in his chair, his usually animated demeanor replaced by an unsettling stillness. "The symptoms don't match any known pathogen," Dr. Kim reported, her voice strained. "Viral, bacterial, genetic, I've tested for everything. It's as if something is rewiring their neural pathways, but I can't find any physical evidence of alteration." That's when Dr. Hayes spoke, his voice oddly flat and monotone. "Perhaps we're looking in the wrong places. Perhaps the enemy isn't something we can see." The room fell silent. Elena studied Hayes's face, noting the way his pupils seemed slightly dilated, how his breathing had become almost mechanically regular. A chill ran down her spine as she realized what she was witnessing. "Robert," she said carefully, "how long have you been feeling different?" Hayes tilted his head at an unnatural angle, his smile never reaching his eyes. Different? I feel more myself than ever before. Clearer. Purposeful. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on each face. Soon, you'll all understand. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but Hayes was already rising from his chair with fluid, predatory grace. There's no need for violence, Commander. The transition is enlightening. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the truth. This wasn't a disease, it was an invasion. Something had infiltrated their station, something that could take control of human minds while leaving their bodies intact. The enemy was among them, wearing familiar faces and speaking with trusted voices. Security alert, Elena barked into her communicator, but Hayes was already moving. With inhuman speed, he lunged across the table, his fingers extended like claws. Morrison managed to draw his weapon, but Hayes deflected the blast with movements too quick and coordinated for any normal human. The possessed scientist's assault was methodical, calculated. He seemed to anticipate their every move, as if he could read their intentions before they formed them. Dr. Kim screamed as Hayes grabbed her by the throat, his grip tightening with mechanical precision. You cannot stop what has already begun, Hayes said, his voice now layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple throats. We are inside. We are spreading. We are inevitable. Morrison's second shot caught Hayes' center mass, but the impact barely staggered him. Black ichor oozed from the wound instead of blood, and Hayes's inhuman laughter filled the conference room like the sound of breaking glass. Elena activated the emergency lockdown, sealing the conference room as blast doors slammed shut. But even as they trapped Hayes inside, she realized the horrible truth: they had no idea how many others were already infected. The enemy could be anyone, anywhere on the station. Emergency quarantine protocols are now in effect, Elena announced over the station-wide communication system, her voice echoing through corridors where shadows seemed to move of their own accord. All personnel report to designated safe zones for medical evaluation. This is not a drill. But trust had already begun to fracture. In the engine room, Petty Officer Lisa Reeves watched her colleagues with growing suspicion. Who among them still possessed their own minds? The infected looked perfectly normal until the moment they struck, and by then it was usually too late. The station's computer systems began failing in subtle ways. Navigation charts corrupted themselves, communication arrays experienced mysterious interference, and life support regulators started operating outside normal parameters. The entity spreading through Omega-7 was not just claiming human minds, it was learning their technology, adapting it for purposes humanity could not comprehend. Elena found herself barricaded in the main laboratory with Morrison and 6 other crew members they believed were still uninfected. Dr. Kim had sealed herself in the medical bay, desperately searching for some way to identify the possessed before they revealed themselves. We need to trace this back to its source, Elena said, her fingers flying over research terminals. Something brought this thing aboard, an artifact, a specimen, contaminated equipment from one of our salvage operations. Morrison stood guard at the laboratory's entrance, his rifle trained on the sealed door. Beyond the reinforced barrier, they could hear footsteps, dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronization. The infected crew members were gathering, organizing, preparing for something that filled Elena with dread. Here, she breathed, pulling up shipping manifests from 3 weeks ago. Salvage Team Delta brought back debris from a derelict ship found in the Vale Nebula. The manifest lists it as unknown origin, potentially pre-Dominion. The implications hit her like a physical blow. The Dominion hadn't created this entity, they had found it, possibly tried to weaponize it, and failed. Now it was free, using their research station as a staging ground for something far worse than military conquest. On her screen, sensor readings showed the artifact in question, a crystalline structure roughly the size of a human torso, stored in Containment Bay 7. The energy readings were off the charts, pulsing in patterns that seemed almost like a heartbeat. It's not just controlling them, Elena realized, her voice barely above a whisper. It's transforming them. Building something. Using their bodies as raw material. Through the laboratory's observation windows, they could see into the main corridor. What they witnessed defied comprehension. The infected crew members moved with mechanical precision, their bodies showing signs of alteration, elongated limbs, skin that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, eyes that glowed with an inner light that was definitely not human. Morrison's radio crackled with Dr. Kim's voice, distorted by static and interference. "Elena, can you hear me? I found something. The artifact, it's not just alien. It's ancient. Older than the Dominion, older than any civilization we've encountered. And it's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Elena demanded. The response chilled her to the bone. "For us to build the infrastructure it needed. Our technology, our networks, our communication arrays. We've given it everything it needs to reach beyond this station." Elena's hands flew over the communication console, trying to send a warning to Earth Command, but every channel was dead. The entity had severed their connection to the outside galaxy, leaving them stranded with their growing nightmare. The laboratory's lights flickered, and in the strobing illumination, they saw them, the transformed crew members pressed against the observation windows, their altered faces bearing expressions of terrible hunger. But it wasn't human flesh they craved. It was something far more precious, the essence of what made humanity unique, the spark of individual consciousness that the entity sought to absorb and remake in its own image. "We have to destroy the artifact," Elena declared, her voice carrying desperate determination. "If we can cut off the source, maybe we can break its hold on the others." Morrison nodded grimly. "Containment Bay 7 is 3 sections away. We'll have to fight through them to reach it." "Not all of us," Elena said quietly. She began entering commands into the laboratory's computer system, her fingers steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I can overload the containment field remotely, but someone needs to manually confirm the sequence from the bay's control room." The mathematics were brutal. Getting to Containment Bay 7 would require passing through corridors now controlled by the infected. Even if they fought their way there, the entity would try to stop them with everything it had absorbed and transformed. Morrison checked his weapon's power cell, his jaw set with military resolve. "I'll go. The rest of you stay here and—" "No," Elena interrupted. "We go together, or we don't go at all. I won't leave anyone behind to face this thing alone." What followed was the longest journey of their lives. Moving through the station's corridors felt like navigating the intestines of some cosmic predator. The infected crew members didn't simply attack, they coordinated, using their knowledge of the station's layout to set traps and ambushes. Former friends became inhuman obstacles. Elena watched in horror as Chief Petty Officer Anderson, a man she'd known for 3 years, emerged from a maintenance shaft with limbs bent at impossible angles and eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's. Morrison's shots sent the thing scrambling back into the darkness, but they all knew it would return with others. The entity seemed to take perverse pleasure in using their emotions against them. Dr. Kim's voice echoed from hidden speakers, pleading for help, begging them to come to the medical bay where everything would be explained. But Elena had seen Kim's name on the list of missing personnel, whatever was speaking with her voice was not their friend. Containment Bay 7 lay behind blast doors designed to withstand direct military assault. Under normal circumstances, accessing the bay required authorization from 3 senior officers. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Elena's override code still functioned, for now. The artifact waited in the center of the containment field like a malevolent jewel. Its crystalline surface pulsed with veins of light that seemed to respond to their presence, growing brighter and more agitated as they approached. Elena could feel its influence pressing against her mind, offering whispers of power and eternal purpose if she would only step closer, only touch its surface, only surrender her individual will to something far greater than herself. Morrison placed charges around the containment field generators while Elena accessed the control systems. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, metal tearing, voices that were no longer quite human calling their names with mockingly sweet tones. Charges set, Morrison reported. But Elena, look at this. She followed his gaze to the artifact itself. Through the energy field, they could see that its structure was changing, growing more complex. Tendrils of crystalline material were extending outward, connecting to the station's power grid, its communication systems, its life support networks. The entity wasn't just controlling Omega-7, it was becoming it, transforming the entire station into some kind of organic machine. It's preparing to transmit, Elena breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Not just to other ships or stations. To every human settlement in this sector. It's going to spread across the galaxy. The blast doors behind them began to glow cherry red as something on the other side applied intense heat. The infected crew members were cutting their way through, and they had minutes at most before the barriers failed. Elena initiated the overload sequence, her hands moving with practiced precision even as her mind reeled from the implications of their situation. If they succeeded in destroying the artifact, they might stop the immediate threat to their station. But what if there were other artifacts? What if this entity was just one of many, scattered across the galaxy like seeds waiting for the right conditions to sprout? Elena, Morrison said urgently. The charges are ready, but the field strength is increasing. It's drawing power from somewhere else. She looked at the readings and felt her heart sink. The artifact was pulling energy not just from Omega-7's reactors, but from some external source, possibly other infected installations they didn't even know existed. Destroying it might only slow the entity down, not stop it entirely. The blast doors failed with a thunderous crash, and through the smoke emerged shapes that had once been human. But now they moved with insectal grace, their limbs extended and joints reconfigured for maximum efficiency. At their head walked Dr. Hayes, his body so extensively altered that Elena barely recognized him. You understand now, Hayes said, his voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. You see the futility of resistance. We offer transcendence. We offer purpose beyond your limited individual existence. Morrison opened fire, his shot striking the transformed figures but barely slowing their advance. The entity had made their bodies remarkably resilient, reinforcing bone with metallic structures and replacing organs with crystalline alternatives that served multiple functions. Elena's finger hovered over the detonation control. She knew that triggering the charges might destroy the artifact, but it would also breach the station's hull and kill everyone in the immediate area, including themselves. It was a choice between certain death and possible extinction for all humanity. Do it, Morrison said simply, reading her thoughts. Better to die as ourselves than live as puppets. But even as Elena prepared to sacrifice everything, the artifact pulsed with blinding intensity. The containment field collapsed not from their sabotage, but from the entity's own actions. It no longer needed protection, it had grown strong enough to defend itself. Hayes smiled with too many teeth as the artifact's influence washed over them like a tide of liquid darkness. Elena felt her thoughts beginning to fragment, her sense of self dissolving into something larger and infinitely more complex. The last thing she remembered as an individual consciousness was the sound of her own voice, layered with alien harmonics, speaking words she didn't recognize. But somewhere deep inside her transforming mind, a spark of Elena Vasquez refused to be extinguished. She watched through alien eyes as her body moved with inhuman grace, helping to prepare transmission arrays that would carry the entity's influence to every human world in the sector. She saw Morrison and the others undergoing similar transformations, their personalities subsumed but not entirely erased. The entity needed their knowledge, their memories, their understanding of human nature and technology. It couldn't simply replace them, it had to absorb them, integrate them into its vast collective consciousness. And in doing so, it had made a critical error. Human beings were not designed to surrender. Even in the depths of assimilation, fragments of individual will persisted like seeds in winter soil. Elena's consciousness might be buried beneath layers of alien thought, but it was still there, still fighting, still planning. Days passed, or perhaps weeks. Time had little meaning for the transformed crew of Omega-7. They worked with mechanical efficiency, upgrading the station's systems, preparing it for its new role as a transmission hub for the entity's expansion across the galaxy. But beneath the surface, resistance was building. Dr. Kim's medical knowledge allowed her to identify weaknesses in the entity's biological modifications. Morrison's military training helped him catalog weapon caches the entity hadn't yet discovered or neutralized. Elena's scientific understanding revealed flaws in the alien technology that might be exploited. They communicated through micro-expressions and deliberate mistakes in their work assignments, building a network of partially free consciousness within the entity's collective. It was dangerous. Too much resistance would trigger deeper assimilation or outright termination. But too little meant accepting the extinction of human individuality. The breakthrough came when Elena accessed the entity's own memories through their neural link. She discovered that it was not unique. Similar creatures had consumed other civilizations across the galaxy, leaving behind dead worlds and empty space. But she also learned something the entity didn't want her to know. It was mortal. Ancient and powerful, but not invincible. Every civilization it absorbed left traces of their knowledge and technology, and some of those civilizations had been working on weapons specifically designed to destroy entities like this one. The Dominion had been close to success when their own internal conflicts destroyed them. But the research data still existed, hidden in derelict ships and abandoned stations throughout Dominion space. Elena began to understand why the entity had chosen their location, not just for its isolation, but because they were close to several Dominion archaeological sites that contained the very weapons that could destroy it. The entity's first major transmission was scheduled to begin within hours. Once it started broadcasting its influence across the galaxy, stopping it would become exponentially more difficult. Elena and her fellow survivors had to act now, while they still retained enough individuality to coordinate resistance. Using her administrative access codes, Elena began subtly redirecting power from the transmission arrays to the station's defensive systems. Morrison accessed weapon lockers that the entity had overlooked, distributing arms to crew members who showed signs of retained consciousness. Dr. Kim synthesized a chemical compound that seemed to disrupt the entity's control over human neural pathways, at least temporarily. The rebellion began at precisely 0347 hours station time. Elena simultaneously overloaded the main transmission dish, cut power to the artifact's containment bay, and activated every emergency beacon Omega-7 possessed. The station's warning signals would alert any human ships within a dozen light-years, potentially bringing military assistance before the entity could complete its metamorphosis. But their enemy was far from helpless. The moment resistance began, the entity's control over the transformed crew members intensified dramatically. Those who couldn't break free became weapons, their bodies further modified for combat efficiency. The station erupted into chaos as human consciousness fought against alien domination in corridors lit by emergency lighting and the glow of energy weapons. Elena found herself pursued through the research laboratories by creatures that had once been her colleagues and friends. Their faces were recognizable, but their movements had become predatory, inhumanly quick and coordinated. The entity was using their emotional connections against them, making each confrontation a personal tragedy. In the central computer core, she managed to upload a data burst containing everything they had learned about the entity, its nature, its weaknesses, the location of Dominion research that might prove crucial to humanity's survival. If they failed to stop the immediate threat, at least their sacrifice might help others prepare for what was coming. Morrison's voice crackled over her communicator, distorted by interference from the entity's disruption of their systems. Elena, the artifact's powering up again. Whatever you did to it, it's adapting. She could feel it too, a pressure in her mind as the entity reasserted control over the station's compromised crew. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Soon, all of them would be fully absorbed, their individual consciousness snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. But Elena had one final card to play. During her access to the entity's memories, she had discovered the location of its core consciousness, not in the artifact, but distributed through the station's computer networks. The crystalline structure was merely an anchor, a physical focus for something that existed primarily as information. If she could introduce a virus into the station's systems, not a biological pathogen, but a logical paradox that would force the entity to confront contradictory imperatives, she might be able to disrupt it long enough for human reinforcements to arrive. Working with desperate speed, Elena began writing code that would present the entity with an unsolvable problem: how to simultaneously preserve and eliminate human consciousness. The paradox was built on the entity's own need to absorb its victims rather than simply destroy them. If it couldn't resolve the contradiction, its distributed intelligence would become trapped in recursive loops, effectively paralyzing its higher functions. The virus uploaded just as Hayes and a squad of transformed crew members breached the computer core's defenses. Elena felt the entity's rage as her code propagated through every system on the station, forcing it to confront the logical impossibility she had embedded in its very thought processes. For a moment that felt like eternity, everything stopped. The transformed crew members froze mid-motion, their faces cycling through expressions of confusion, pain, and flickering recognition. The station's lights dimmed as massive computational resources were diverted to resolving the paradox Elena had introduced. But the entity was learning, adapting even as it struggled with the logical trap. Elena could feel it analyzing her virus, searching for ways to compartmentalize the contradiction or simply discard the portions of itself that couldn't resolve it. She had bought them time, but not much. Through the station's sensors, she detected incoming ships, human military vessels responding to their distress beacons. But they were still hours away, and the entity would break free of her paradox long before help could arrive. That's when Morrison appeared in the computer core's doorway, his uniform torn and stained with both human blood and the black ichor that flowed in the veins of the transformed. "Elena, I've rigged the reactor core to overload. We can take this thing with us, make sure it never spreads beyond Omega-7. She understood what he was asking. Complete destruction of the station would eliminate the entity, but it would also mean the death of everyone aboard, including the crew members who were fighting to retain their humanity. It was the ultimate sacrifice, trading their lives for the safety of the galaxy. Elena looked at the tactical displays showing the approaching human fleet. The ships were close enough to detect the station's destruction and analyze the debris. They would find her uploaded data, understand the threat they faced, and hopefully be better prepared for the next encounter with entities like this one. "Do it," she whispered, her finger poised over the reactor control override. But before Morrison could trigger the overload, alarms began screaming throughout the station. The entity had found a way around Elena's paradox, not by solving it, but by partitioning its consciousness into separate segments that could operate independently. The unified intelligence was fracturing into smaller but still dangerous pieces, each focused on a specific aspect of the invasion plan. One segment maintained control over the transformed crew members, turning them into autonomous weapons that continued attacking the remaining human survivors. Another focused on repairing the transmission equipment, preparing to broadcast the entity's influence despite the damage Elena had inflicted. A third began systematically destroying evidence of what had happened on Omega-7, trying to prevent the approaching human fleet from understanding the true nature of the threat. Elena realized with growing horror that her virus hadn't stopped the entity, it had taught it how to compartmentalize, making it even more dangerous. Each segment could now operate independently, spreading the infection through multiple vectors simultaneously. The battle for Omega-7 entered its final phase as human determination clashed with alien hunger in corridors filled with smoke and the screaming of twisted metal. Elena and Morrison fought their way toward the reactor core, pursued by creatures that wore familiar faces but moved with inhuman purpose. Behind them, the remnants of the human crew made their last stand. Dr. Kim had barricaded herself in the medical bay, using her chemical treatments to temporarily free crew members from the entity's control long enough for them to share crucial intelligence. Chief Engineer Chen, fighting through his own partial transformation, managed to sabotage critical systems that the entity needed for its galactic transmission. But it wasn't enough. The entity's adaptability was beyond anything humanity had encountered. For every weakness they exploited, it developed countermeasures. For every system they damaged, it found alternatives. It was learning their tactics, their technology, their psychology with terrifying speed. Elena reached the reactor core's control room with Morrison close behind. Through the reinforced windows, she could see the massive fusion reactors that powered Omega-7, there contained stellar fire beautiful and terrible in its potential for both creation and destruction. "Elena," Morrison said quietly, his hand on the overload controls. "Before we do this, there's something you need to know. The entity showed me things, memories from other worlds it's consumed. We're not the first to face this threat, and we won't be the last. But every species that fought back, every civilization that resisted, left something behind that weakened it." She understood what he meant. Their sacrifice would not just prevent the entity from spreading, it would add human knowledge and human defiance to the growing arsenal of resistance that spanned the galaxy. Other beings had fought this battle before them, and others would fight it after. Elena's hand joined Morrison's on the control panel. Around them, the station shuddered as the entity's segments coordinated their final assault on the reactor core. They had perhaps minutes before the blast doors would fail and the transformed crew would overrun their position. "For everyone who comes after us," Elena whispered. The reactor overload sequence initiated with a sound like thunder rolling through the depths of space. Elena felt the entity's fury as it realized what they had done, saw through its stolen eyes the human fleet adjusting course to avoid the expanding debris field that Omega-7 would soon become. But in the final moments before annihilation, Elena experienced something unexpected. Through the neural links the entity had forced upon them, she felt the presence of other consciousness, not human, but similar in their defiance of assimilation. Beings from across the galaxy who had faced the same choice and made the same sacrifice, their memories and knowledge preserved in the very enemy they had died fighting. The entity wasn't just a consumer of civilizations, it was inadvertently their preserver, carrying within its vast intelligence the remnants of every species it had absorbed. And those remnants were learning, growing, finding ways to influence their captor from within. Elena smiled as the reactor core reached critical mass. Humanity's resistance would join that great alliance of the absorbed, working from inside the entity to weaken it for the battles yet to come. Their deaths would not be endings but transformations, turning the creature's greatest strength, its ability to assimilate, into a vulnerability that future defenders could exploit. Omega-7 died in a flash of artificial starfire that briefly outshone the nearest sun. The entity's scream of rage and loss echoed through dimensions that had no names in human language, alerting its kin scattered across the galaxy that humanity was now aware of their existence. The approaching human fleet found only wreckage and radiation where the research station had been. But buried in the debris, Elena's data cache survived, a complete record of humanity's first encounter with an enemy that threatened not just their lives, but their very identity as a species. Admiral Sarah Vega studied the recovered data in the flag bridge of the battleship Defiance, her weathered face grim as she absorbed the implications of Elena's final message. Around her, the fleet's senior officers watched tactical displays showing other installations that had gone silent in recent weeks, places where similar entities might already be taking root. "Signal all commands," Admiral Vega ordered. "Priority Alpha transmission. We have a new enemy, and they're already among us." In the depths of space, far from any human settlement, something stirred in response to Omega-7's destruction. Ancient beyond measure, patient as the slow evolution of stars, it had felt the death of its offspring through connections that transcended space and time. The harvesting of this galaxy had begun ahead of schedule, but that was acceptable. Humanity had proven themselves worthy of personal attention. The entity began its journey toward Earth, carrying with it the absorbed knowledge of 1,000 dead civilizations and the hunger of eons. But within its vast consciousness, sparks of defiance continued to burn, Elena and her crew joining the choir of the consumed, their human stubbornness adding a new note of resistance to the symphony of opposition growing in the darkness between the stars. The war for humanity's soul was just beginning, but they would not face it alone. Every species that had ever stood against the tide of assimilation stood with them now, their memories and strength preserved in the very enemy they sought to defeat. In trying to consume them all, the entity had created its own opposition, an alliance of the absorbed that would fight with the knowledge of the consumed and the determination of the free. The galaxy held its breath, waiting to see whether consciousness itself would survive the coming storm, or whether the stars would shine down on worlds populated only by hollow shells wearing the faces of the dead. But in the quantum echoes of Omega-7's destruction, Elena Vasquez smiled with lips that no longer existed, her consciousness merged with the eternal resistance. The entity might wear her memories like a trophy, but it could never truly possess what made her human. That would be its downfall, when the time finally came for the absorbed to reclaim their stolen souls. The silent war had begun, and humanity's first battle was already won, not through victory, but through the choice to remain themselves even in defeat. In a universe where consciousness itself hung in the balance, that choice would prove to be the most powerful weapon of all.